So let me welcome everybody to the Presidential Speakers Series at Tulane. I'm Mike Fitz, president of Tulane, and I can't tell you how excited I am about this series. We have on this webinar, we have students and faculty and staff and alumni and parents from all over the country, and we're all united by one thing: we all bleed green. And this series has really been so special for me. It's an opportunity to bring to campus, in this case, virtually to campus, individuals who've been part of and made history. And it's an opportunity to talk to them, understand what led them to break down all these barriers, and get their perspective on their lives, and more generally on our society. Now, we started this series with an old friend of mine, Sonia Sotomayor, who talked in a really riveting discussion in front of 2,000 people at McAllister Auditorium about how she went from the Bronx to the Supreme Court. And it was a lesson in life and grit that I think really was incredibly impactful for everybody who participated. And then the second group was Ruby Bridges, as well as Mark Morial, really icons in the civil rights movement, who talked about literally the history of the civil rights movement in the United States, and they really spanned the entire era. What links all of these people together, obviously, is their connection with history and their insights on history, but also their personality. These are people who've broken down all sorts of barriers and are what we like to say, full of growth mindset. They see a problem and they deal with it and confront it. That, I have to say, is a quality I think of as Tulanean, particularly Tulanean, both coming back from Katrina, dealing with this pandemic, just in so many different ways. Now, today we have two people, I just want to call them icons, both of whom are graduates of Tulane. I should note, graduates of the engineering school at Tulane. And also, I believe both are Summa graduates of the Tulane Engineering School. They literally have been, in a sense, so critical to sort of, advancing our society in very different ways. True superstars, and they epitomize what I talk about as growth mindset. Now, just in order, let me note we have Doug Hurley, came all the way down to Tulane University as a ROTC student, went on to the Marines, and then from there joined NASA in the year 2000. And it truly has been a part of history as the commander of the SpaceX Crew Dragon. And of course, the entire world was riveted by his accomplishments. I should note, and I say this to everybody, I am in such admiration of our two guests tonight, but I could never do what they do, and I could never go up in a spacecraft. No way, no how. But clearly great admiration. Then our second guest, Lisa Jackson, an incredible alumnus and figure in so many different parts of American society, my friend. She's currently Vice President of Environment Policy and Social Initiatives at this modest startup in California called Apple. And she's part of the senior leadership team at Apple, really focusing on issues of sustainability and social initiatives in a fundamental way. Prior to that, she served in the Obama administration as and the cabinet as head of the Environmental Protection Agency. She comes to us, not surprisingly, from California, though she grew up in New Orleans. So we claim her as part of NOLA. So I wanted to start out giving you each an opportunity to talk a little bit about your life, because everybody's asking the question, how did you do this, right? How did you in a sense grow from sort of where you were as a youngster, all the way to the height of success in this society. And I want to start out with Lisa. As I said, grew up in New Orleans, went to Tulane, and then initially, I know, went to graduate school at Princeton, and then went further in environmental, and then became head of the Environmental Protection Agency, and now to Apple. Just give us a sense of the arc of your career. How did you do that?
Well, I'm getting to that point where I can look back on a career. I always say to folks, I know that when I was at Tulane studying, I didn't have this whole idea of how my career would unfold. And so we sort of go back and look for through lines. I grew up in the Ninth Ward in New Orleans. In fact, the home I grew up in was destroyed in Hurricane Katrina. So my dad was a mailman. My mom, when she worked, actually worked as executive assistant, in various capacities, sometimes a substitute teacher. And so, I think early on, this public service, and I noticed all of your guests so far have had a real commitment to public service. I know that's not an accident, Mike, and I'm honored to be among this group and with Doug today. But I think my dad as a mailman, I remember very much this idea that everyone on his route knew him. For a while, his route was the French Quarter, which was kind of cool. But everyone knew him. He really took an interest in the people on his route. And I think somewhere in there, that public service seed was there from a very, early age. He was in the Navy when he came out of the war as a black man in the still pretty segregated South. The opportunity to be in the U.S. Post Office, a place for opportunity, was there for him. So, I told this story, but I grew up wanting to be a doctor because I was really good in math and science. And, I was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first in our family to go to college. And so we really didn't know what an engineer was. I actually went to a program at Tulane when I was at Dominican High School to introduce minority students to engineering. And I went because if you went, you got a free calculator. And I was enough of a nerd that I thought that would be pretty darn cool to have, a programmable calculator. But what's kind of been a through life for me, a through thread, is this idea of public health. And it was at Tulane that I really became aware of the threats to public health from the environment, from poor air quality, from poor water quality, the Mississippi River and the pollution that it carried. And somewhere along the line, I switched from engineering pre-med to engineering. We didn't have environmental engineering. The country didn't really have a field called environmental engineering, but I became really interested in that. And that was while I was going to school on a Shell Oil Company scholarship. So I think it was also really not about saying industry is bad, but industry has a responsibility. If you're going to be an engineer, you have a responsibility not just to create the future, but to ensure we do so with a level of care that protects future generations. As you said, I went on to graduate school at Princeton. I thought I'd be a PhD, but I really loved the practicing of the science. Engineering is really about practical solutions to problems, and I think I wanted to get into that world. And I found myself at the Environmental Protection Agency by 1987 because I really believed it was the place in the world to be if you wanted to work on issues around the environment. I was there for almost 20 years, started a family, 9/11 happens, I'm in New York at our office in New York, and thought I would take an easier time of it and move to the New Jersey offices. And that was when I moved from being a career bureaucrat, if you will, public servant, to a political appointee, and met Senator Barack Obama a couple of times, and the rest is sort of understandable. When he got elected, asked me to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. Did the first term there, and my father always said, leave a job when you're having the most fun, which took me forever to understand what he meant. But I really felt I had done all I could for the president and the country after 4 years, and we needed to have another person try to take the environmental ball further. And not long after I announced I was leaving, I heard from Tim Cook here at Apple, who, as you know, has a real passion for this set of issues around sustainability. So I've been here about 8 years now. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
It's quite a nutshell, I have to say. And I, needless to say, we talk about it all the time. The motto of Tulane is not for oneself, but for one's own. And it truly an outward-looking university, and it's clear you were part of that from day one. So Doug, it's been an incredible career. Growing up in Upper New York State, coming down to New Orleans, and then off both into the Marine Corps and then into NASA, and then being the commander of SpaceX and other flights. You have to step back and give us a sense of how this kid growing up in Upper New York State, in a sense, pursued this career that led him ultimately into outer space.
Thanks, Mike. It's such an honor to be here sharing this speaker series with you and Lisa. And yeah, it was a bit of a long road to get from upstate New York down to Tulane and then to the International Space Station. My dad worked 2 jobs as an engineer, and then he had his own machine shop. And my mom stayed home and raised my brother and I, and followed all the sports and all the things that families do. But it was a very almost sheltered existence in many ways. And I just felt like I needed to see a little bit more of the world, which is, I think, one reason I ended up in New Orleans, almost on a lark in some ways. My junior or senior year, this Navy recruiter came to our high school for a college information night, and he started talking about, we can give you all this money with a scholarship if you join the service. And I had an interest in airplanes, especially fighter jets, but no real exposure to any of that stuff. But at least it really spurned an interest in an opportunity that maybe I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And so that led me to at least give Tulane a shot. It was a long way away from home, 1,200 miles away from home. So there was not a lot of opportunities to drive home on the weekends in case I was feeling homesick. But just an incredible environment to grow more in that, you're just exposed to the city of New Orleans and that academic environment at Tulane, and just meeting people from the South and from the East and the West that, I had just never met very many people growing up in such a small town. So it was just a really neat way to kind of get you out of your shell to some degree and to grow and to just see really a little more of what the real world was really like. And then the environment at Tulane, of course, Lisa, I'm sure can attest to it. Engineering, you had to stay very, very focused if you wanted to remain in engineering and remain on a scholarship. So it was very challenging from that perspective, but it just built some incredible life skills as I moved forward into my career, and time management and priorities and all those things that needed to be met to maintain your scholarship, to do your ROTC duties, as well as to keep up with the engineering demands. So it was just an incredible 4 years. And I don't know if I'd have ended up in the same career arc had it not been for the kind of the personality of the university, as well as the personality of the ROTC unit. It just really, both experiences were just incredibly unique and really set me up for my follow-on career. So after graduating in 1988 and receiving the commission in the Marine Corps, I headed off to, all the Marine Corps officers have to go to Quantico for a 6-month course called the Basic School, which is every Marine is an infantryman first, and then you get to go do what you want to do after that. And so that was an interesting experience, but really enjoyed it. Was able to go to the infantry officers course after that, and worked my way down to Pensacola in 1989 to start Navy flight school. And then flight school is a fairly long process, a year and a half or so, and then ended up out on the West Coast to fly Marine F-18s for the better part of almost 6 years before I was selected to go to test pilot school. The test pilot school part was interesting in that, as I've talked about this before, my interest wasn't necessarily going to space or becoming an astronaut, certainly not at the time I was at Tulane. It was something that may have developed as I started flying fighters and realized that there was potential. But what really sewed it for me was having that engineering degree, which allowed me to be selected to go to test pilot school, which is where all NASA's pilots in their astronaut program have come from. They were all former test pilots. So it really was not only because I enjoyed the engineering that I did at Tulane, I was in civil engineering, but it paid dividends a decade later, allowing me to be at least competitive to get into test pilot school. So that test pilot school year happened in 1997, and then I was a graduated test pilot and did some very unique flight tests with the F-18 Super Hornet and other things in the late 90s, and then was put my name in the hat for the astronaut corps in 1999 and was lucky enough to be selected in 2000 with my astronaut class of a total of 17, I believe. As I got down to Houston, of course, it was everything I thought it would be and more. It was very exciting to meet a very diverse set of folks that came from the science, engineering, technology type backgrounds, but very diverse in that, we had military members, we had PhDs, we had research scientists, biologists, all those different fields coming together to make a team. And then, of course, being exposed to the astronauts that were already here, some of them legends like John Young, for example, being able to be in a meeting with John Young, a person who walked on the moon. It just, you had to pinch yourself every now and again to believe you were in that same room with him, let alone doing the same job. But we had about 2 years of training, and then as astronauts, you're kind of off doing what we call technical assignments after that, and had to wait several years for my first chance to go into space. And part of that was the Columbia accident in 2003 was a very difficult time, not only for the agency and our office, but certainly for the country, as we lost 7 friends. And so that going through that mishap and going through the things that we needed to go through to get the shuttle back flying again were difficult, challenging, and it took a few years. But finally, in early in 2008, I found out I was going to be on STS-127, which was my first flight, and then subsequently flew that one, STS-135, which was an incredible experience, as it was the last shuttle flight in the program in 2011. And then, as you mentioned, started working in 2015 on the commercial crew program with both SpaceX and Boeing. And then in 2018, was selected to be the commander of the first SpaceX test flight, which we accomplished last summer, which was just an incredible experience.
It's quite a story. I must say, we were all with you as you were being launched off into space at that moment, praying for you. So you've both mentioned a lot about how Tulane education and experience was important to you. We've a number of questions people have asked, and I want to start with one of them, who is from Kimberly Foster, who is the dean of the School of Science and Engineering at Tulane University. So why don't we listen to Kimberly now?
Hi, I'm Kimberly Foster. I'm dean of the School of Science and Engineering at Tulane. Doug and Lisa, you both went in very different directions after graduating from Tulane. I would be very curious to hear how your Tulane education contributed to your success and to your career path.
So I must say, you both talked about that, but is there is there things you would like to add, especially, about the specifics? I know, Doug, you talked about engineering, but Lisa, what about your, in a sense, your education at Tulane specifically made such a difference for you?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think I'm not sure we went in very completely different paths because we both have sort of had this public service and then we've made our way to the private sector, but after time certainly wouldn't compare to this extraordinary service that Doug just outlined. But look, I think the engineering school at Tulane, one of the things I loved about my time there was that it was a practical training. I was a chemical engineer and am a chemical engineer. So for me, this idea that you didn't graduate unless you did that summer long operations lab where you learned how to use equipment. And I think one of my frustrations out in the world when I went to graduate school, Princeton is a great school, was I missed the applied nature of the way we were taught to think about problems in engineering school. Um, and I know that continues today because of Kimberly's leadership. But back then, Dean Sullivan and the school, we were taught to apply what we learned, and we were given very practical ways to approach problems and encouraged with internships and mentorships to do that work. So I think that's number one. I think the experience of, it's funny hearing someone from 1,200 miles away and me from, 12 miles away, not even from the center of campus. But this urban experience that is Tulane, this campus in the middle of a city and all that that meant, I think also encouraged a thinking of community that for me, I carried with me into my approach to problem solving. One of the things I had to do as head of the EPA was come down during the Deepwater Horizon explosion and spill. And the first thing I wanted to do was talk to the community of fishermen and people who I knew those waters and understood, because they might also know a lot of might be family with a lot of the people who served on those rigs, what we weren't seeing. So I think that the way New Orleans and the community interacts is part of your education that you get at Tulane. And Doug called it Southern, I would call it New Orleanian, this idea that we're going to talk it out and figure it out. I carry that as part of me as well. And then I think probably maybe also the idea of learning to work in teams and to be really collaborative, which, all throughout my career, I think has been really important to me.
I must comment. Every institution has its culture and DNA, and that connection with the outside world is core to Tulane. We were founded as a medical school dealing with yellow fever and a pandemic, and that it's that commitment, and then obviously community service, which is now sort of the identity of Tulane University, and our relationship with New Orleans. It's just, there's nothing quite like it. Our fates are tied together. So I can absolutely understand that. So we have another question about sort of experiences. This is from Isaiah Underwood, a undergraduate student at Tulane University, about literally leadership and life skills.
My name's Isaiah Underwood, and I'm a first-year student majoring in international relations and management. And I'd like to know, in your time at Tulane, how did you balance your academics with your other involvements and still find time for yourself? And on your way to finding that balance, did you kind of pick up any leadership or life skills that you really feel have impacted your current success?
So Doug, I mean, obviously somebody who's part of ROTC, and you think of sort of that as life leadership training. How would you respond to Isaiah?
Well, it's a great question. I think, for me, it was time management was huge. I remember taking 18, 20 credit hours, and then the added demands of the ROTC above and beyond. We would have the drills, and we had stuff that in the evenings, and of course we had a class typically every semester. So it really was learning time management and learning how you navigated through the day. And it had to start very early, certainly my freshman year, just because of the challenges that we talked about with engineering. You know, you had a test almost every week, or you had a major lab every week. So it was not a case of, oh, you know, I've got till midterms. It was literally that week you had to be prepared for many, many things. And so the time management was almost forced on me from day one. And I think it really helped, certainly for my future, because that's the way the military operates. And certainly ROTC prepares you from a leadership standpoint. We would do many, many exercises where we would do small unit leadership, whether it was in the field or whether it was in the classroom. And so you certainly had the advantage of those instructors and their experiences in the military to pass them down to you. But they were all extremely valuable to kind of get you set up for, as Lisa mentioned, you know, just the way a team needs to operate to be successful. It's got to be about the goal. It's got to be about the entire team's work, not just one individual's success, and to be able to motivate and put them in the appropriate direction that they need to go to solve the problem, and give them all the things that they need to be successful. And I think that, frankly, that's my whole career has been about being parts of teams, just like Lisa's, whether it was a squadron, whether you were in a flight of 2 F-18s, whether you were in a crew on a space mission, an astronaut class, any of these things, you know, in order to be successful as a group, you cannot be worried about your success as an individual. It's got to be all about what the team needs to do to succeed.
So I have to ask both of you, you've both been involved in organizations that are just, viewed from afar as part of history. Lisa was in obviously the cabinet and the White House, and now part of Apple, which is, one of the most, I don't know whether you iconic organizations in the world. Doug has been not only part of NASA and the astronaut corps, but also working with SpaceX, private industry at the same time. We're constantly at Tulane thinking about, how does culture matter? How does relationships matter? How do you build teams? I'd be fascinated to hear your perspective on these different organizations. So, Lisa, why don't we start with you?
Sure, as long as Doug goes, because I'm dying to hear his answer. But listen, I think we've already sort of circled around some of the things that really matter in the government. What I loved about EPA, most people don't know this, but second to NASA, I think EPA has the highest concentration of engineers and scientists. So I felt at home among folks who made their living and did their work based on, science-based investigation and experimentation. There's also lots of lawyers and others, so not to say that we don't have, but there's a high concentration of work. Protecting the environment is quite technical. And so I think those teams, we have to translate that science that we're learning into the best way to protect human health, to mitigate the risk that form from pollution or from products or activities in the past, like toxic waste sites, which I worked on for a long time. So what I loved the most was looking for people who had that, and I'm going to come back to practicality again, but it's that ability to take science and turn it into a solution, turn it into an approach. And who could explain that? Risk communication and scientific communication, I think also extremely important set of skills to have on a team. Here at Apple, I think, there is the vaunted, and you and I have talked about this, Mike, what strikes you at Apple is that the place was set up literally. I'm putting my hands in a circle because the building I'm sitting in is shaped like that. but it was set up around collaboration, around this idea that you put really, smart people together in a room, experts in their field, folks who've been thinking about these problems a long time, and then you force the best solution by asking all the hard questions and continuing to iterate. And it's actually pretty inspiring here to see how many things that sound like amazing ideas on day one, by day 300, because it can take that long, are been totally scrapped, because you learn from all these disciplines about what works and what doesn't. And so I'm a huge fan in the innovation machine being about collaborations and relationships that form around, as Doug said, this idea of a common purpose, whatever that is. In government, that purpose is prescribed by where you work. At EPA, it's protection of human health and the environment, a noble purpose, one that everyone there, I think in general, you're attracted to that agency for that reason. And here at Apple, is making the best products for the world because we really believe that those products democratize technology and learning, and empower people to do their best work. So I think it's been a through line, this idea of collaborating and relentless focus on hearing from the diverse group of people around the table.
Doug, how would you describe your experience with the different organizations?
It's remarkably similar listening to Lisa. I think, certainly probably there's three distinct organizations that I've worked a fair amount for, between the Marine Corps, NASA, and then of course the astronaut office within NASA, and then the last 5 years working very closely with SpaceX, and each of them uniquely different. The Marine Corps, it's a little bit more authoritarian. It's a little bit more, the boss says we do this, so that's what we do. But you still have to develop those skills of being able to count on people that have stronger abilities in one way, and then play that off of the folks that maybe can't do certain things as well, and then try to team those people up such that they can become the best element, whether it's within an airplane or within a multi-plane exercise. And then at NASA, within the astronaut office, certainly an incredibly diverse group of people from science, technology, engineering, and math, as well as, we've got physicians with just a huge variety of careers and experiences, age differences to some degree. And so, bringing that group together and just all the different ideas and different points of view that we have, it takes something special to make that group work successfully, but it happens. And, as you put yourself, whether it's within a crew or working on a simulator that day, whatever the case may be, it just brings, bringing that whole group together and focusing on one task, which is to successfully complete the mission, ends up being what you're looking for. And I think certainly the astronaut classes that we picked in the last decade have really, really shown that diversity, that difference of experience, that difference of, just as simple as backgrounds, but it adds to the group dynamic, and I think it makes it a better group going forward, especially when you become a crew. And then, of course, working with SpaceX, it sounds somewhat similar to Apple. You just have an incredibly, incredibly talented group of young people, not necessarily initially the most experienced group when it comes to spaceflight, but they've rapidly become that just in the last several years. But just young people who are come to the table with different ideas. And I think that's been the challenge for NASA working with SpaceX, is just you have a group from NASA who's, this is what we've done for the last 50 years. We've done human spaceflight. And then we have a group from SpaceX that's been doing some spaceflight for the last decade, and then marrying those two groups together and becoming better than the two organizations as a whole, and actually flying people on a commercial vehicle. And just that collaboration and the excitement of that young workforce and being able to work with them, and then hearing these different ideas that you wouldn't have even considered as a solution for even the most mundane things that we do in space, and you're just like, wow, that's an awesome idea, and working through those and not maybe shutting those ideas down because it's like, well, that's not the way NASA did it, so we're not going to do it this way. And being open to those new ideas, I think for me personally, it just reinvigorated my perception of the way people view spaceflight, especially when humans are involved. And it just was just an exciting experience to be part of that team as SpaceX built this vehicle.
Yeah, I know, Doug, we've spoken about how important the diversity of the astronaut corps and its SpaceX was to your success. And it's a diversity of background. You mentioned geography, racial diversity, gender diversity, and that how it improved the outcome in everything you did. So anyway, yeah, fascinating. This next question is for Lisa, and it's going to be a video. It's from Laura Wilt, a graduate of Tulane University, and it's about this whole issue that Lisa, you talked about, this private-public partnership and the relationship between the two. So let me turn it over to Laura.
Hi, my name is Laura Wilt. I graduated in 2005 and 2014 from the business school. The global pandemic has really highlighted the need for public and private cooperation. What are ways that you see public and private entities can work together on sustainability?
Thanks, Laura. Look, I joined Apple from EPA specifically to work on environmental issues. And when I was interviewing with Tim and other members of the team, I was as curious as to why you want the ex-head of the EPA. Most people, industry usually runs from the ex-head of the EPA. Why? And I think it's illustrative of how we approach problems, which is get people who understand the problem deeply and tell me how to be a leader. It was a recognition on the part of Tim and the company that because of who we are, because of the place we occupy, we have a voice, we have resources, we have the ability to make a dent in a problem that affects all of us. And I loved the idea and continue to. And I think part of it is engineering training. I never thought of business as the enemy. I think business has an incredibly important role to play. Regulation is important, but where the fun really starts is when you find leadership companies who want to go far beyond what's required to really innovate us to solutions, clean energy solutions or energy storage solutions or new material processing solutions that solve the problem and create opportunity for growth at the same time. So I think business is incredibly important on issues of environment, on issues of diversity, as Doug just spoke about. I think it is incredibly important in all STEAM fields, not just technology, engineering, but also the arts and math, that we have teams that look like the communities that we are serving. And I love the fact that as a consumer products company, Apple has to be very closely tied to the people who own and use our devices. And I love that connection because I think it's a vital one. On January 13th, we released our Racial Equity and Justice Initiative projects. And I just want to take a second on them because Doug spoke so much about diversity. I think over the past year, we've seen that this country still has a lot of work to do. That segregated South may not be there, but as a country, we've still not addressed the issues of race and systemic injustice in education, in economic opportunity, in the criminal justice system. So just yesterday, we announced here at Apple, Tim had announced a $100 million initiative, and that's going to go towards a center now to be located a physical center, but also a virtual center for HBCUs to be located in Atlanta, a new application development center to be located in Detroit, money for venture capitals and banks to lend to Black and Brown owned businesses and businesses that serve underserved communities, and then scholarship opportunities. Look, I'm a product of a Shell Oil Company scholarship. And so I believe that companies need to step up to help communities that may, I may not have been able to stay at Tulane had I not gotten that scholarship. I remember when I got accepted, my mother looked at me and said, I don't know how we're gonna do this, but if you got in, honey, you're gonna go. And with it, I remember that day in my freshman year when I got called in and told that my tuition was taken care of. Extraordinary moment. And so that level of access, so that all the bright minds out there have the resources that they need, is part of what not just Apple, but businesses have to take on. And I think we have responsibilities, and I think those responsibilities are never more clear than in times when government might be slow to act or can't act as quickly as the private sector can.
Doug, have you seen this you've been part of government and then at SpaceX? You talked about diversity, but what do you see as obligations across the country among both private business and universities and so on in this area?
Well, I think, you almost see the government leading in many of these ways. Like I said, the astronaut office is as diverse an organization as I've ever been part of, and it's great to see. And yet, as Lisa said, it's just a start. We've got lots of work to do, and I think for us as astronauts, we can help as role models, inspire by who we are within the office and the goals that we have as a group and for the country. And I think that goes a long way. And I just hope that we continue to do that as a country, because we do certainly have work to do, but we see things starting to work in a direction, and we need to keep going in that direction. And certainly as NASA has talked about, one way of inspiring is our Artemis program, which is to go back to the moon. Part of that is to have the first woman set foot on the moon. And I think that is a huge inspiration to the next generation of STEAM graduates working their way through their careers. And hopefully it will provide that inspiration to see a diverse group of people exploring the moon like we hope to do very soon.
Lisa, I have to ask you a personal question, which is, you're a woman of firsts. You were the first Black person to serve as head of the EPA, and you're now the only Black executive in the leadership team at Apple. What does that mean in terms of the obligations that you face, in terms of the challenges that you face in moving forward as a professional and a leader in business and in America?
I love the first part of your question, which is what obligations does it put? It means we have to not be the last, as we've heard so eloquently. We need to be committed as professionals to bring more women, to bring more students of color, more professionals of color, more opportunity. I see that as part of my role here at Apple, and that is again, I think that's just part of the training, this community of people. The way we feel as alums of Tulane University, I also feel about my community, that I have an obligation to try to lift up the Black community. It's just part of who I am. But I think in terms of challenges, look, I have been blessed and incredibly able to pursue my passion, which has always been around human health and the environment, through a number of different opportunities in my career. And I sometimes pinch myself. This one's much better paid than some I've had in government. That's just the difference with public service. But none none are any less rewarding. And so I think the challenges of being first or being only are just a moment to step up and make sure, I think, if anything, that you're better prepared so that people don't doubt um, your reason for being there. Some people might look at you, oh, you're a scholarship student. Or some people might look at you and say, oh, they just put you in that job because you're a woman, or because you're Black. And of course, you kind of bear that burden and you say, I'm going to be twice as prepared. I'm going to be 10 times more prepared. And you know what? That's not a bad thing, because that comes back to you. That's an investment you're making in yourself. So it might feel like a burden at times, but the payoff, I mean, my mother and father were very much that same way. Look, okay, so you have to study harder to get it. So sad, because you're going to get it. Like, they just didn't care. So, I mean, I know it feels hard and that sounds a little trite, but if you think in the back of your mind that the challenges are really just investments to make you better, then I think it makes it a lot easier. And honestly, I've also been really fortunate in my career to work with public servants and others who have been incredibly helpful to me. Lots of people who aren't Black and aren't women. And so you have to find those people, and they are out there. And they have been incredibly important in my life.
So that leads us directly to, I think, the next question we have, which is from Claire Hubley. I'm sorry, a student, first year student, recent third year student at Tulane University, asking about how you deal in stressful situations. Claire.
Hi, my name is Claire Hubley, and I'm a junior at Tulane studying public health and digital media production. And my question for you is, with all of the strife and challenges in our world today, in times when you have felt overwhelmed, how have you been able to move forward and stay motivated?
Doug, no one's come on.
Doug, let me just say, as I've said to Doug before, if I were sitting on that rocket ready to go up, I couldn't have handled that. I really. So the question is, how do you handle those things?
Well, I think, for me, it's a little bit harder to kind of quantify, because I think it's been a whole career of it now. We call it in aviation, we call it compartmentalization. So, you're focused on the task of flying the aircraft or flying spacecraft, but you've also kind of done all the work to get to that point, all the preparation to get to that point, to know that if there's anything that happens that might potentially be bad or life-threatening, that you've been trained and you've studied and you understand and you know the ways to mitigate that, if there are ways to mitigate that. So I think certainly, just in general as a society, the last 10 months have been difficult on almost everybody. In fact, I remember hearing while I was still in space last summer, why do they want to come home? And, probably a fair question, because I think at that point people had their fill of dealing with a pandemic. But I think, where you have to go in those situations is somewhat similar to what I do professionally. And it's just, you focus on the things that you can do, focus on the things that you can improve, and accept the things that you can't change, certainly right away. Also, you have to have confidence in your government, your health officials, in this particular case, that they'll do the right thing, and the scientists to find a vaccine. And look where we are 10 months later, some unprecedented development of vaccines for COVID. It's just amazing to me to see, when smart people put their heads together, what can be accomplished. And we'll come out of the other side of this. And that's the other thing. I think you need to be optimistic that you will be successful, whether it's, as a society we get through this pandemic, or whether, in my case, I was supremely confident because I had worked with those people for 5 years straight. I worked with I've known Bob for 20 years, my crewmate, and had every confidence in those teams to get us to and from the space station safely. And I think that in of itself is part of it. You just have to, I know there are things in society, there are people in society, there are people in this world that are not good, but you have to believe as a whole that, people are trying to make their lives better and we'll get through this.
Lisa, you've obviously dealt with adversity though here on Earth, not up in the stars. What sustains you when you're facing challenges of that nature?
I think self-care first. This is a really stressful time. I think about students. My own kids are a little, just past college age, but it is really important to take care of your health, to find that way of refocusing your energies, in terms of mindfulness or whatever works for you, exercise, all those good things. But I think in the larger scheme, in terms of sort of how do you keep the optimism we just heard from Doug, or how do you keep forging ahead, I really say you need a couple of role models in your life. You got a great one right here. Doug's a great one. But you need to keep your eyes fixed on people who have faced what must look like insurmountable odds, must be looking up at this mountain that seems incredibly high and starts with a first step. I had the privilege of knowing pretty well Congressman John Lewis, a living hero, someone who I always think about that moment when he looked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and knew with certainty that he would be lucky to survive, much less, but he knew he was going to be beaten, and he couldn't fight back and had no way to, even if he wanted to, but was committed to not. So whenever I get in my zone, I think about that. I think about, the fact that this country has had those kinds of people, who have looked at a challenge that seems insurmountable and have overcome it, or a woman like Kamala Harris, who looks at the presidency and has gotten to be vice president-elect, or any of the amazing women leaders who have not only had to deal with all the other challenges in front of them, but also had to deal with the fact that this country has not necessarily seen itself as women-led, in a number of different fields for a long time, the boardroom, government, even academia, as I look at the people who have forged new ways. So find those people who inspire you because they had even bigger challenges.
I must say, I started out talking about growth mindset and the attitude of confronting issues and problems and busting through those barriers. And I can't think of a more articulate demonstration of that growth mindset than what I've just heard. I want to sort of end with a question which I've asked actually of all of the different presidential speaker series participants. And it's especially important at this moment in time in our history. We have been facing health issues, moral issues in our society, economic issues that are really almost unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime, and challenges across the board, which we're confronting head on. And so the question I want to ask is sort of, given all of this, what gives you hope? What do you see as the as the path forward? What doesn't keep you up at night? To the contrary, makes you want to jump out and get up in the morning. Doug, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think for me, what gives me the most hope is and I see it whenever we interact with young children, just the excitement they have for not only, space flight, but just the excitement they have to go jump into the world and make a difference. And it just reinvigorates you whenever you get a chance to talk to young people. And, you can see that from some of the questions we got from some of the current students at Tulane. And I saw it very much so when I was collaborating with SpaceX getting ready for this flight. And I think that's what gives me hope, is just the incredibly talented young people that our universities are producing. And as Lisa says, given those opportunities to as many people as we can is so important. And that's, I think, really when it comes down to it, is just this next generation of inspirational folks, regardless of what fields they pick. Obviously Lisa and I chose public service to a great extent, or government service for our careers. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but just become something that's greater than yourself, and show that passion to get us where we need to be as a society. Like you said, Mike, we've had an extremely challenging year as a nation, from a pandemic standpoint, from a political standpoint, and just looking forward to the difference that these young people can make is hope enough for me. And I'm looking forward to seeing what they can do with their lives and their careers.
Yeah, and I think I have to say ditto. I mean, I think a couple of things. My passion is always going to be the environment, always going to be around sustainability, climate change. We're not leaving the best table set for the generations behind us, but we have to work together on this problem. I have been inspired. The environmental movement started oftentimes with young people who just simply refused to accept the status quo. That's why we had an EPA in the first place. I was one of those young people who just couldn't understand, and wrote a letter to President Nixon when I was little. Couldn't understand why this was so hard, really, 8 years old. And so I think seeing that mantle being taken up again, but by a younger generation that, the same, that has tools we could not have dreamed of when we were studying engineering. And so, the amount of knowledge that's available to them, the amount of the ability to be connected and collaborative for good things that's available to them. And frankly, your generation doesn't, to me, have a choice. We need them to be as good as the people who would use these technologies for bad. We need them to be as connected and committed as at any other time. So I get hope, because I realize that whether it's my kids or other kids, that we somehow, maybe we didn't do too right by the planet, but we have this generation coming behind that is ready, and frankly has to tackle these problems.
Wow, I can certainly understand why you were both path-breaking individuals. This is truly inspirational for me. We talked about, in a world where there's so many barriers, individuals make a difference, and you both have made such a difference in your own careers, and made history as part of it. And you're also obviously an inspiration to all of us at Tulane. Your answers to the last question also underscore why it is somebody like me does what I do, which is it's the next generation. It's the young people, and their passion, their love, and their creativity, which is really going to be the future of this country. And I can't think of a better way to end this seminar. I want to thank both of you, Lisa and Doug. An incredible discussion. The question is, how do we thank you adequately? If we were in New Orleans, of course, I would give you a big hug, but can't do that. Can't even do that. Can't even do that if you were in New Orleans. But we have sent to you something that I hope you both have great love of, which is kin cakes and Mardi Gras paraphernalia, which should have been sent to you and arrived already. It should be outside waiting for you. I hope it'll bring back fond memories of New Orleans and your time at Tulane, and hopefully will create an incentive for you to come back when this pandemic is over. So anyway, thank you. This has been inspiring. It's been insightful. It's been educational, and it's really, I think, shown what I think is wonderful about Tulane, which in the end is our public spirit. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for everyone out there for joining us in the latest presidential speaker series. Thank you.